Okay, we're going to take it from 7 lines down, page 10. We're just going to pick it up from this juicy Maimer Azal that kind of sums it all up. It says, Liola mihe adam rach kakana, bal ye kasha ke'eres. A person should always be soft like a reed and not hard like a cedar tree. Right? So the idea is, davar kasha mitzad evios vayeshu shabo, something which is hard due to its thickness and its arrogance. Ein bo nati l'shum tzad. It does not have any give, right? It cannot be persuaded to, and leaned to any side. Aval davar harach mitzad harako shabo, but something which is soft due to its soft nature, be'etzem, essentially yecholin tos l'chol tzad. It can be swayed to every side, right? Like a reed, right? Like the wind can come slapping it around and it doesn't break, right? Whereas something which is a tall cedar tree, it's extremely powerful. The cedar tree is taken here as the analogy because it's the tallest and most strongest tree in the world. Right? We're talking about like the ancient cedars of Lebanon. They were like the redwoods, right? They were giant trees. Beis HaMikdash was built with them. No joke on a tree there. But the problem is they could snap, right? Because they're hard, they don't have any give. They're firm, they're strong in their position. But if something opposes them, they can't weather the storm, as it were. Not flexible. So this is the idea of the difference we're describing between the spheros of Tohu and the spheros of Tikkun, right? That, okay, the spheros of Torah are unbelievably powerful. We said they're like the kochos atzmiyim. They're pure, like purebred, unadulterated midos, but they smash if you put another one in opposing it. Whereas the spheros of Tikkun, we said it's exactly what we were just talking about, right? Like the Zohar with the Vav or the Zohar without a Vav. If you contract it, right, bring it down, okay, it's less powerful, but now it's, so to speak, closer to you, it can integrate. Bedugma kazos, and in the example of this, Yuvan Bechinas HaMochin, we're going to understand that, going back to the analogy of the brain, or the mind, Shemitzara Bittul Shebehem, Harihem Mechalakim Kol Davar Muskal Lekol Gile or L'Riboy Chalakim Pratim Rabbi. Right, so just the general notion of the mind, right? And we said yesterday that the concept of the mind is really the ability to make the great tikkun, right? That the chokhmah and the mochin, it's able to subdivide everything into a million parts and therefore sort of find the unifying aspects of each part. Right? If you break something down, we said, for example, the most extreme example, like you can bring out fire from water and water from fire. If you break down the elements, right, you can find the opposite inside of yourself. And how does that come down? How does that come out? Through the nature of the mind. And there's a general concept of mind, which is that the Shviros HaKelim didn't happen in the mind. In other words, when we talk about the 7 nations of Canaan, why is there 7 evil midos and not 10, right? Because the shvira that happened, the break that happened in the world of Tohu, because of the midos that were hard like cedar trees, they only broke in the realm of the midos, right? The mind spheros did not break. There was not a shvira in the Chabad. And for the reason that we've been saying, when something gets charged emotionally, that's when it doesn't have any give to it, right? And you just like made up your mind, and it could be strong and like this sort of like powerful young spirit, and it's like standing its ground. But so it's got all this power, but it will shatter. Whereas if the older sort of sage, he can stop and reflect on something. He doesn't maybe get as powerfully motivated behind something in an emotional way, but it doesn't break. And so the spheros of Tohu themselves, only in the 7 spheros of the emotions they broke, but not in the mind. And what's the reason? Because the mind has an intrinsic bittul to it, right? Even though there's the spheros of mind of Tohu, right? And Tohu in general has this power, but in the spheros of mind, there's a natural bittul, because what is mind basically all about? Mind is when you're attaching yourself to the subject matter. In other words, when you're in an intellectual state, you are not the subject of the conversation, because you're trying to attach yourself to and receive something when you're in the process of understanding. when you're in a process of emotions, right? When you take it out of the mind and you take it upon yourself to experience an emotion, so then you are the subject. It's all about you, basically. It's how you're feeling. You're not at that point receiving, you're sort of projecting an emotion. So the nature of the way mind works is that our minds in a natural way, when you're busy concentrating and studying, that's what I say, if your Yetzer Hara bumps into you, should drag him into the base medrash. If you're like upset or angry or things are bothering you and like your emotions are getting out of control, just start learning. It really works. And the reason is because you get out of yourself, you attach yourself to something which is not you, and that's an intrinsic state of bittul, right? Did you want to say something, Chaim?
Yeah, so the way I understand it is the thoughts and the beliefs control the emotions. So if you have a strong belief, you'll feel a certain way about something. So does that mean that the beliefs of the mind are stronger so they won't break because they affect the emotions? Do you see what I'm saying?
Thoughts and beliefs, I think, first of all, are two different things.
Maybe let's just stick with beliefs then. The beliefs
have nothing to do with thought.
No, but don't they lead to an emotion? Beliefs?
So belief is emotion in a certain sense.
But the beliefs are stored in your mind, right? Your beliefs are stored in your mind. What you believe.
I would say, if you want to go into this direction, you would say that you could say like this. It says in the Zohar, "Is ratzon ve'is ratzon." Belief is like will, right? And there's will and there's will. It says in the Zohar. What does it mean? There's two wills. There's a will above the mind and there's a will below the mind. Which means there's an aspect of your will which is real belief. Right, where you believe something even though you don't necessarily understand it. It's like you're just like your religion, basically, right? You just believe that. So that has to be then broken down into a Chabad, and you can start to be like a Talmud Chacham, investigate your religion, and come to certain, intellectually sound understandings of your own belief system. So now you've gone down from Kesser, which is belief, to Chabad, which is intellect. Now we're talking about the mind controls the heart. You can forge a belief, which is now really an emotion. The word ahava has the word ava in it. Ava means will. So love and the midos, they are actually like a miniature version of belief. And for the same reason, they're not intellectually based. Just like belief is above reason, when you finally hatch a midah, which is also like a belief, which is it now becomes below reason. You might have arrived at it through reason, but now that's the point. It becomes like an animalistic, like this is my feeling. I hold this. Now you can always retract that and like import or export your intellect to chill out and to mellow your raw emotion. That's exactly what we're talking about here. You don't have to let your emotions run wild because they are forged by intellect. Right. You can always like bring back the intellect and have more introspection and like calm them down. Right, so that's called being soft like a reed as opposed to hard like a cedar tree, right? So what we're saying here is why was there no shattering in the mochin in the mind, right? And why are we saying that the analogy of the reed is like the mind itself? Because the mind has an intrinsic bittul, because they divide everything intellectual into their parts. That's how you think, right? You're like, let's break it down. It's literally what you say, right? So it's looking to mellow the raw power of something. It wants to break it down. It wants to take it into its parts and like sort of dissect it, which minimizes the strength of something. Just in the general functioning of the mind. The kol gilui or l'riboy chalaki v'pratim. Every revelation of light, it wants to break it down into many parts, right? And it's like we said again, if you have like a pure chesed, it looks very powerful, very strong, very overwhelming. But if you break it down into its parts, you realize, there's a little gavor, a little teferis in there. There's all the colors of the rainbow. So it loses its raw strength, which is positive. It bittles itself. That's called natiyah l'kol tzad. Right? That's called being able to be leaned in different directions. Right? When you're an intellectual, they call it like a cold intellectual, which doesn't necessarily have the best connotation, but it's cold because you're not charged, you're not heated over it, because you can see all the sides. So what are you going to get excited about?
So you're saying
you can even get to a point where you find the exact opposite inside of yourself. Like we said, you can find water inside of fire. You could certainly find Gevura inside of Chesed, right? Shammai can find inside of his own arguments the logic of Hillel. And when you do that, then all these opposites actually realize that they're one. Right? In other words, if there's chesed inside of Gevura, then Gevura suddenly does not have to oppose chesed anymore. It's like, I get you. And so those two things which were originally opposite, those two people that were originally opposite, those two groups, those two societies, they're lying to themselves and to you when they say that they're polar opposites. If they would use their intellect and break themselves down with introspection, they would find the opposite of themselves inside of themselves, and then they can join with the other person because it's actually them. And we said, how is this like a certainty that they're going to find such a thing? Because yesterday's class we talked about that in the root of all things, everything was one. Not that there was only one thing, although it's a combination. All the many were in a state of oneness, which means even when the many come out and they could be drastically polarized, they're lying to you, because in a concealed state, those two polarized things were residing as a singularity at one point, which means they must have a common ground. Here, Shimon, can we give you a mimer?
Give me a mimer.
Give me a mimer. Take two. We're going to be like about 12, 13 lines down, page 10. This is the true type of unity, by the way. We just stumbled on something very deep. One of the principles of Chassidic here. When you talk about Achdus and unity, this is the real Achdus and unity. When you have many details that actually join with each other, and help each other, right? That they wind, instead of being opposing each other, they wind up aiding each other. Ad bli asher yimtza rosh v'sov, to the point that you can no longer, they aid each other so much that you can't anymore find head or foot, beginning or end. So let's give an example of head and foot, right? If you just want to take the pure powers as they are individuated from each other, the head and the foot, which let's say like the greatest Talmid Chacham and like the biggest simpleton, okay, they really have nothing to talk about. They're polar opposites. Like what this guy's living in is like a world of tumah and filth and just like silliness. He's the feet. He's literally like has dirt all over him, right? And he's just like acting like an animal. Whereas the brain, the pristine genius of the generation, he's like up in the clouds. He's like meditating on the angels in the heavens. If you would just take these two things, they would be completely diametrically opposed to each other. They would not be able to join. When they come into the body, right? Which is the idea of Adam Ha'elyon, which is the world of Tikkun, right? The difference between the spheros of Tohu and Tikkun, by the way, is their configuration. The way that the spheros are configured in the world of Tohu is they're all in one straight line, which means they don't have access points to each other, right? They can't relate to each other. Whereas you've seen the famous diagram of the spheros that we always draw. That's the diagram of the spheros as they are in Atzilus, in Tikkun, and you see that there's lines connecting every single sphera, and they all can benefit from each other. So they all come together to form a singularity. The line is you have like 10 different things. The construction of the spheros is that you have 10 different things, which they're called partsufim, which means a face. And just like your face, right? It's exactly a face. You have 2 eyes, right? 2 nostrils, 2 ears, and a mouth. It's literally like the spheros, right? Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus. You got like 7 little points on your face. But when you look at a person, you're not like, hey, nice right eye, man. No, you're like, you have beautiful face. Because you see the whole thing as one, right? Because when they come together and like serve each other, each one has a complete, it completes the other. And so it is with the foot and the head, the beginning and the end. We say that they get so unified that you can't tell anymore which is the beginning and the end. So this foot, who's dirty on the floor and diametrically opposed to the brain, when they come into the body and they sort of serve each other and utilize each other, as the famous analogy goes, the head can't get anywhere without the foot. In which case, the foot is the head of the foot is the head of the head in that one capacity, right? It rules the head in the fact that the head would just be sitting there like looking around all day on the floor, right? If it wasn't able to have motion and enact its great ideas with its foot. So in that capacity, the head receives from the foot. The foot is its master. Because when things come together, even the simpleton, who has nothing to offer the situation, basically, to the king, guess what? The king is useless without all the simpletons, because they make him the king. They obey his orders. So in that level, the king is subservient to them, in a sense, because he needs them in order to be king. So when you break yourself down and recognize your relationship with the other, which means you have to realize that there's a bit of the other in you, then it becomes such a unification that you don't even know which one is greater or worse anymore. Everybody becomes equalized at that level.
And that's the level of
Atzilus or Tikkun.
Atzilus. And then, would you say the spheros were in a line?
In Tohu, they're in like the way they're drawn is in a straight line. Meaning to say that they don't have any interaction with each other. They like the one above interacts with the one below, but like there's many spheres that like don't see the light of day, so to speak, with the other ones.
And what state is that?
That's called the state of Tohu. That's the broken state. That's going to break.
Okay. That's above Atzilus.
That's recognizing each individual strength, it's above Atzilus, as like raw and a purebred. Like there's something called pure intellect, and it's called pure foot, and each one has their own qualities, but they're not uniting with each other. And what we're trying to say here is that real achdus and real unity, strangely enough, is not when you have one. It's when you have many that come together, and that was the great principle that I was alluding to before. It's not like we're going to get into it much more, but it's known from the principle of Shavuos, right? On Matan Torah. What month was Matan Torah in?
Sivan.
Oh, we got 3 different options here now. When was the Torah given? Sivan, the 6th of Sivan, right? So it says in the Gemara that it was given in the 3rd month, 3rd from Nisan, to the 3-part people. It's a 3-part Torah. Right, and it was given to the third born, because Moshe was the third born. And on the 3rd day, it was the 3rd day of the Hagabala, right? From the so it says all these things 3. So
3rd day from what?
When they were told not to come up the mountain, there was a boundary put on the mountain. It was called the Shlosha Simei Hagabala, the 3 days of separating them, and then on the 3rd day of that experience, it happened. And so it says on the 3rd day.
3,330.
Was it? Anyway,
4 years ago.
So the point is, if this is like Hashem Echad coming into the world, right? This is the ultimate concept of unity that like descended on earth, which never had, there was the world was just like a plurality. All of a sudden, Hashem is giving the Torah, Hashem Echad. The question is, why is it coming in 3? Why is it coming all these 3s? Right? Why is 3? A closer, like the true representation of Hashem's oneness. I mean, it sounds like another religion a little bit. Even it's crazy, right? What's shtus? But actually they got it from us again, right? What's it all about? Why is 3 more one than one?
Because you need that third person to make peace between the two.
That's right. Because one, and this is the exact story of what we've been saying in that whole crazy diagram that I gave yesterday. When you have all the spheros as one. Right? It seems like everything is unified as they possibly could be. The potential plurality is in a state of singularity. And so you got only one. There's no one to bother you. It's like Hashem's reigns supreme. It's just that when Hashem then wants to show what he's made of, and he wants to basically express like the potential powers that he has, those powers come out as tohu. Because basically as we've been described maybe 10 times in this class, when he wants to show the individual aspects of himself, and yet they're all coming directly from a perspective of Ein Od Milvado, then each part feels that it's the whole, because it is infinite. And it's a purebred, right? Nothing. So when those powers come out, they clash with each other, and this creates a notion of duality. Or if you want to just say Hashem, when Hashem created the world, basically, now there's this notion of Hashem and his world. There's this concept of 2. Essentially, whenever you have a thesis, you have the antithesis, right? If you're going to posit that Hashem is one, right? So you've already created the theoretical reality that maybe he's not. Why are you saying he's one? Right? Because it could be that there's many. And you're saying, no, Hashem is one. So the second you want to say that there's only one thing, you really are already, at least in theory, assuming that there's many things. And the reality is by Hashem, there are many things. Inside of that oneness, he can produce an infinite number of many. And so the only way you actually can solidify the true reality of that Hashem is one is by taking, so to speak, the antithesis into account. You're like, okay, well, what if there was many? Then you have what's called the synthesis. Then you then synthesize the one and the many. And only when the many themselves will agree that they are also part of the one. Like you said, when you make shalom, you make peace between the now potential opposites, then you can say that it's a oneness which is not, so to speak, bulletproof. Because any objection or contradiction to this oneness has already been taken into account and negated. So the number 3 was chosen by Hashem in all these different ways to promote his true unity, because once you have Hashem's unified, not only because he is the singular only one, but because the parts have also come into the picture and given their position. They've argued. And now you have the Shlishi Hamachriya, the third one who comes together and makes sense out of the two opposing concepts, which is singularity and plurality, and it's made it all back into one. It's made that the plurality itself recognizes the singularity. Now it's a type of unity which is unshakable. And so therefore, when you make a unity out of parts, it's much greater than a single unity when you have only one thing, strangely. Right? Yeah, did you want to say something?
I wanted to ask, does the Torah agree, does the Torah mention anything about a multiverse?
Yeah. The Torah is speaking about multiple universes long before Marvel.
Yeah, not multiverse in the sense of within this physicality, within this universe, there's lots of different worlds that are just like ours with every slight different variation. It's more like a multiverse in terms of the 4 levels of worlds.
Based on our
it's not like a multiverse that people like to think of in contemporary, right? There's every option simultaneously in one physical realm. There's a world that's just like this.
I don't think the Torah is look again. I don't think that the Torah is not necessarily negating such a concept. It's just that, in fact, on the contrary, I think the Torah does recognize the theoretical many realities happening at once. Like for example, when Moshe went up on the mountain, just in halacha perspective, when Moshe went up on the mountain, it said Hashem showed him 49 reasons to make every single halacha kosher or non-kosher, innocent, guilty, and he showed him a spectrum that all those things are true. You could say that it's kosher, and there's 49 different reasons why it's kosher, and there's 49 different intellectual perspectives as to how to kosher this thing. You can go to 49 different great sage rabbis, and they each give you a different answer why it's kosher. And then simultaneously, on the very same piece of meat, you go to 49 different other sages, and they'll give you 49 solid different reasons why it's not kosher. So Moshe was like, Rabbi, what are we supposed to do about this? How do we rule? Because in Hashem's universe, so to speak, there could be multiple truths, and they're all true. It's just that for us in this world, we have to paskin halacha. We cannot live in a realm where there's multiple realities happening all the time, even though there are. We have to sort of bring it down into a singularity, and therefore we have to rule on the matter, and then we're given instructions. How do you rule? You go after the majority of sages. So we choose one of those things and essentially bring it into the truth which reaches even into this world, which is one way or the other. But just like that's true, let's say in halacha, that there's many possible realities over this one piece of meat. Spiritually speaking, that could be true about our whole existence. I'm not saying, I don't know if it is or it isn't, but I'm saying it's not foreign to the Torah's conception of reality in any way. It would be. But I don't really want to get totally lost on this thing, right? But it is interesting. Let's move on in the mimer, shall we?
Don't we sometimes rule though, a hector in certain areas or leniency regarding the situation? So there is kind of two.
That's why, because there is a totally parallel truth, or some other truth, and sometimes you can rely on it. You can pull it into your world. Yeah, we spoke about filling yesterday. Exactly.
Are there certain things though that are immutable truths at this point? You can't get a hector to eat a cheeseburger.
Yes, they're immutable truths, but. It says, for example, it says, for example, that the word pig is called a chazir. And one of the reasons it's called that is because chazir also means to return. Because when Mashiach comes, or when Tchias HaMesim happens, or whatever, it's going to return to being kosher. Right? So ultimately, yeah, I mean, that's what it says. So in other words, put it like this. We know that in the times of the future times, right, the immutable laws that we have is basically anyone who rules like Beis Shammai is considered that he's just wrong, right? Because when they voted in the ancient academies, Beis Hillel just won. There's only a handful of times when they allowed Beis Shammai to be in the ruling law, and they said that those few times that they voted like Beis Shammai, it was such a sad day for Israel. It was like the day they built the golden calf. And in the future, we know the Arizal tells us that all the halachas are going to be like Beis Shammai. We're going to go like Beis Shammai in the future. And the Rebbe explains in a very wondrous and awesome sikha, which one day we'll hopefully learn together again. I'm sure we learned it over the years, Shimon. That why is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? Because actually Beis Shammai was smarter than Beis Hillel, but they were less numerous. And we said before that we go after the majority. And since Beis Hillel was the majority, even though they weren't as sharp, and actually, as it turns out, the Rebbe explains, Beis Shammai was ruling according to Kabbalah. They were ruling according to the secrets of the Torah, and those secrets were not revealed generally to all people. So the Beis Hillel couldn't rule that way. You have the similar things happening today, by the way. There's like people who don't rule, let's say like the Alter Rebbe, they may very well not be ruling according to Kabbalah, because he ruled according to like the deeper inner secrets. And if you don't know those deeper inner secrets, you're not allowed to rule that way, because a judge must rule in accordance with what his eyes see. You can't just say, because that guy said it, I'm going to do it, unless you're a student. Right, but if you're on the dais of being the judge, you have to understand it and paskin accordingly. So all the students of Beis Shammai were much brighter, but they were much fewer. So in the future, when the Beis Hamikdash will be built and the Sanhedrin comes back together, we're going to bring the band back together. Everyone's going to be learning Chabad Chassidus. They're all going to be Kabbalists. And therefore, Beis Shammai's opinions will become much more numerous, and the whole Sanhedrin is going to go like Beis Shammai, which means every single immutable law that we hold today will be completely flipped and opposite. Chazir. It's going to just return to the opposite side, because this is a real thing. It's not just theoretically that Moshe went and saw all these opinions. They're all true. And what we apply to this world depends on the situation of the world you happen to live in this finite version of the universe, which is really where the main show is. Right? This is where it all...
Who said who said this that it's going to flip?
The Arizal.
The Arizal said that.
Yeah.
The future Shammai will be the...
Yes, he did.
It doesn't depend on the time period. Right?
It's connected also with Korach, right? Korach was the great enemy of the people, but he said in the future, we're going to hold like Korach.
They're both right.
Like, because he was really, even though he was opposing Moshe, but it was not for, he was too, it's basically, he was kind of like a socialist, right? Kulam Kadoshim. And if you try to apply socialism, communism in the present era, it doesn't work. But it's like this messianic dream of perfection. That's exactly what it is. It's a messianic dream of perfection, which is not relevant to the present day. Okay, let's move on.
When did the Rebbe say we start?
Let's move on. Do you mind? Because we're getting lost. Okay, so when we're talking about when many parts come together, and that makes oneness, and each one winds up not only not being opposed, but they wind up being an aid to each other. They receive one from the other. That because you have one, it now necessitates the other one. In other words, I gave you another example of this the other day, that we had Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. They had different opinions on when the creation happened. One said the first of Nisan, one said the first of Tishrei, and it looks like they're diametrically opposed. Like they can't both be right. And then the Arizal comes and says no. One says it's the beginning in thought, and one says it's the beginning in speech. So it turns out not only are they not opposing from each other, they now receive from one another, and they now require one the other. In other words, the speech needs to know when it was in thought, and thought needs to know when it was in speech. You can't have speech without thought, and you can't have thought without speech if you want to have creation in its full form. So these diametrically opposed opinions wind up first accepting and then necessitating the other one. They're on the contrary. They're totally not opposed to each other. They need each other. What'd you say?
Isn't that Hashem?
I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm sorry. Say that again. How does that limit Hashem?
Because he has to think before he speaks. Like
he doesn't have to. He just did. V'hu amisis ha'achdus she'ein kan hafachim klal. And this is real unity, because now you have no such thing as diametrically opposed. You have no real opposites. So that's like the ultimate unity. Every possible thing is in the set, right? And whereas if you only had one, you have that antithesis. You have that theoretical opposing guy over there. So you have to deal with him. You got to bring him into the family. Now, this is exactly what we were saying before. This type of achdus, even though you've minimized the spheros, right? And they've become like mellowed out and sort of joined that partsuf, that face. They're all working together. So each sphera is, let's say you could argue, weaker. It's like a little reed compared to a cedar tree. But this type of achdus is much greater than the achdus that as these powers were when they were included inside of the essence. Remember we said all those powers when they were in the one. And there was like ein od milvado, and all the potential 10 spheros were actually residing at a state of pure oneness with Hashem. You would think to yourself, you can't have more achdus than that. That's like simple oneness. He says, no, when they come out and they break and they all get back together again, it's actually a more solid realm of achdus than when they were literally all one. She's close, but who mipnei she'enim nikarim matzias. And why? Why is it like that? Because, and this, I mean, all this is like psychologically the secret to getting rid of sinas chinam. If you just like, it's not a far jump to take all these theoretical thoughts and put them into your life. But what he's saying here is, why is the achdus greater when it's an achdus of parts as opposed to singularity? Because why was there an achdus when everything was inside of one? The achdus was there because you couldn't recognize anybody's individuality. Of course it's going to be a one, right? It's like the family all gets together and you don't have any problems until the kids are teenagers, right? Because they don't even know who they are. Their whole identity is like basically their father and their mother. So it's very easy to keep the family together because nobody knows who they are yet, right? Once somebody has an opinion and it goes against the father, now you got a problem. So when your achdus is based on the fact that you can't recognize a person's individuality, it is achdus. No one's arguing with anybody, but it's only because you don't know who anybody is. But in reality, they don't really have it. That's not the happy family that it looks like. Because as soon as little Jill and Sally and Bob and Tim like come out with their opposing forces, they're like, no, we're communists. No, we're socialists. We're for Trump. We're for whoever, right? Then the family's going to fall apart and crumble because now each one has their own individual state. Right, and only when they're going to then realize they each need each other and be soft like a seed, like a reed, and be flexible and come together, they're going to realize, oh, wait a second, right and left are two sides of a whole. We don't want to just like have right and left fighting with each other all the time. It's really the right arm and the left arm, and they pick things up together, right? That's the true achdus, when you create Adam out of singularity, right? And this is they join with each other. When the individual nature of the spheros is tucked inside of the singularity, really, you have a recipe for disaster. Because what was the first stage that happened when those 10 spheros actually did emerge from their state of oneness? Tohu, right? When the individuals came out, they all fought with each other. They couldn't stand each other. So that shows you that even when you had the simple oneness with all these powers tucked inside of it, that was only like what we call a Cold War, right? There was no machloikas. Everybody was one, but that's because you didn't let anybody show themselves. V'mizgala, and if they would have showed themselves as they did, they would be minagdim zelazeh. You would have tohu. You'd have total chaos, which is what happened. Which is why we still are suffering from the universe shattering. Aval bekan. But now that they've broken and the pieces come back together, they join with each other. And when you use the mind, right? How do you fix that teenage state, right? Of just gotta be me. You have introspection. You look at yourself. You say, my father wasn't really totally opposed to me. I can see myself in him, and he can see himself. If two people have to play the game, right? You have to have two people who are going to do the introspection, so they can actually realize that they're not actually diametrically opposed. My values were inside of him, and his values are inside of me. And alavai, we work together, we'd have the strength of both of us. And there's really no opposites. Adarabah, they strengthen each other, they support each other. That is called true and lasting, everlasting unity. Once you have that, as we said, you can't oppose it anymore, because all the theoretical oppositions have already come out and been put to rest. The Nimsa, and this, by the way, is the definition of Chassidus, by the way. Chassidus came to the world to do this to Torah. Because remember that idea I was telling you about before, about the sage and the foot, the simpleton, and how they could actually have nothing to do with each other and be totally opposed to each other. That was pre-Baal Shem Tov Judaism, right? There was an absolute hatred that the sages had for the simple people. They considered them like less than human. The Baal Shem Tov came in, no one realized what he was coming with, right? He was coming with Chassidus, ultimately he was coming with Chabad Chassidus, the intellectual framework of Chassidus itself, and it made everybody be friends. That the sages adopted and Makaroved, and look what you have today. You have the greatest soldiers of the Rebbe going out and teaching Aleph Beis to like mamish, like people who are like atheists and deniers of God. They go into the like Reform shuls, and that's where they find their congregants, right? And they run after them with a love. Because it taught us to basically not see the other as other, but the other as me. Avos Yisrael is the principle of the whole Chassidus. And in a more intellectual way, Chassidus did this to the Torah. In other words, why did the sages all of a sudden change their tune? Because Chassidus starts to look and show you that inside of Torah, every one of these 70 faces of Torah actually has all the other faces in it. Right? And it's basically this notion of finding a unifying concept in every single area of Torah, and then each piece of Torah is no longer such a threat to the other. Nimsa HeChaltzu shemitzad mochin. It comes out.
Couldn't you also view it there was an arrogance of the sages not to share their Torah with the common people? It could go both ways. You know what I'm saying? It couldn't just be that sages are at such a high level and just left everybody behind. So it seemed that the simpleton could be upset with the sages for not sharing the Torah as well, or not coming down to that level, down to their level, no?
The simpletons were just, yeah, you could say that. I mean, whatever it was, they didn't speak a common language. They couldn't find like the Pintel Yid, the true binding force which makes them not only not opponents, but accept each other, not only accept each other, but require each other's existence. They couldn't find it. Like the Friedrich Rebbe came out of prison, he spoke about the idea of the Jewish people are compared to a vine. A vine has the branch, it has the thorns, it has the leaves, and it has the grapes, right? And you can't have a vine without all those things. You need the thorns in the Jewish people, which is like the Amei Aratzim and the simpletons. Like they play a necessary role. In fact, the word tzibor, which means a congregation, is a Roshi Tevis for Tzaddik, Beinoni, and Rasha, right? And on Yom Kippur, right? We talk about the idea that we allow ourselves to daven with the avaryanim, right? There's like a little special prayer that you say. We're going to like allow ourselves to pray with the sinners, because in fact they actually help you, because when you're praying with a sinner, you look good, right? And so like having them in your this is what we do, right? In other words, they play a certain interesting role that's required, even the sinning Jew. And of course, the real role the sinning Jew plays is higher than the tzaddik, because his function is to be a Baal Tshuva. And he then represents this idea that the ultimate symbol of God's unity is not the tzaddik. Why? Because the tzaddik could fall. It's like Hashem. There's an antithesis. Right? Maybe there's not righteousness. Maybe I can choose otherwise. The Rasha chose otherwise and then came back. So he stands higher than a tzaddik for the same reason we've been explaining. He's already gone to the other side, and from the other side, he said, no, it's not as good as righteousness. So he actually promotes Judaism greater than the tzaddik does.
Rabbi, we always hear that last thought.
Wait, hold on a second. You got to be in the class for at least 3 minutes to ask a question. That's the rule.
Very simple. Isn't it true though that the Baal Tshuva is only higher once he corrects all the mistakes he makes and fixes them, not just instantly? Because he did a lot of damage.
The real standing of someone who can call himself a Baal Tshuva, who's actually higher than a tzaddik, yeah, he's more than a tzaddik. He's perfect.
After he fixes.
He's perfect, and he's even more so than a tzaddik. So, but nonetheless, even in one act of tshuva, right? You have just done something that a tzaddik cannot do. So even though, yeah, your status as a human being might not be as high or even close to or even touching with like a 10-foot pole of an actual tzaddik, but even so, in that one act of tshuva, you've done something a tzaddik cannot do. Let alone the fact that if you've actually correct yourself perfectly, you're greater than the tzaddik. Fine, that's a hard level to reach. But why is the Rebbe always talking about a Baal Tshuva then if none of us can actually reach there? Because every act of tshuva turns darkness into light, something a tzaddik cannot do. Therefore it comes out that it's a strange, here we see it like again, the principle. Division itself creates a type of unity more than unity creates. Right? What do we basically have just figured out? That there's a division for division's sake, which is just separation, and then there's division for unity's sake, when you divide something up and find the opposite. And we said that when division for unity's sake creates a greater unity than simple unity. So it's exactly what we just said about the Baal Tshuva, using, so to speak, the weaponry of the enemy, right? Using and transforming it into something positive takes you to a place which is higher than you would be without the enemy, right? So division, so to speak, is the enemy, right? Opposite of unity. And yet when you use division specifically, you get to a higher level of unity than unity alone. Than singularity alone. And this that we find from the standpoint of our mind, that we all have different opinions, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, as the saying goes. So even though that could be a very troubling thing if you're stuck in a cedar tree type of perspective, but if you're like a elevated human being, then you realize that all your other Jews who have different opinions than you, all the other 9 guys in the minyan, this is not a problem. In Kedusha, this is your greatest strength. That's why the Jewish people are like 12 sons of Yaakov, and we're a people that has one little piece of land, but we self-divide that into 12 parts, and that's our strength, because we recognize that each one of the tribes actually creates our nation even greater. But if each one of the tribes doesn't recognize or have the need for speculation and finding then they're at odds with each other. And so that's what I'm trying to say. Like, what does Chassidus do? And why is, I once gave probably 25 years ago, I was at a Shabbos table, someone asked me to speak, and it was like a Misnagdisha table. So I said, I was quoting the Rebbe, and I said a piece of Chassidus, and they're like, don't you know anything else? There's 70 faces to the Torah. So I was okay, sorry. I was literally just it was my first Shabbos I ever kept or something. It was a little bit over the top. And then I realized later, I read in Chassidus, what does it mean there's 70 faces to the Torah? Because there's 7 midos, right? And the truth is that there's really 71. Because if you look at the Sanhedrin, there's 70 members, but there's Moshe Rabbeinu who sits at the top. There's 71. If you look at the languages of the world, there's 70 languages, but there's Lashon HaKodesh. There's really 71. If you look at the number of nations, right, there's 70 nations, but then there's the Jewish people. There's really 71. There's 70. Why is there 71? Because all those 70 are actually one. They just break into parts, and the one is this thing which you have to find inside of each one of the 70 in order for them to realize that they're one. So the reality is, Chassidus is the 71st face. It's the penimius. It's the penimius of. So it's not there to say, oh no, my piece is bigger than your piece. It doesn't get into that game. It's the one piece that everybody has in common. If you look deeply into yourself, you're going to see that if my halacha can be learned according to Chassidus, and your halacha could be learned according to Chassidus, and when they are, it binds them both together. It makes them realize that they're both part of one. So it's the healer of the soul of the Jewish people. That's why it's sort of waited to come out until the end of days. We need it in order to have the necessary self-inspection, self-reflection. I keep forgetting the words. In order to break ourselves down and unite, so that we don't find ourselves being tribal and warring against each other, but we realize your part, you realize their part. If so, on the contrary, there's a quality of having many now. Because when you get all the many working as one, now you got this unbelievable powerhouse. And that ultimately is what the name Yud Kei Vav Kei represents. Right? If we're so, same thing we said about Matan Torah, why is it in 3? If we're so stuck on 1, then the name of God should have been like a symbol, right? Why do we have to have, why is it Yud Kei Vav Kei? Why is it a 4-letter word, right? No problem, right? You could just have a Yud. Every time you want to have Hashem, Yud or a dot, right? Why do we have to have a name of God? Because the name of God represents true unity. And the 4 represents really all things in the kingdom. The man, the animal, the plant, the inanimate, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, earth, wind, fire, air. These 4, north, south, east, west, everything's like 4, right? The 4 camps of the Jewish people, the 4 camps of the angel. Everything comes out as 4, and it's one. Havaya Echad. So we're saying that there's 4 pieces, put them in one word, slap a echad at the end of them, and that's what real unity is when you have all the different parts basically being together as a whole. That is your greatest unity. We don't want a singularity. When you have many parts coming together to make a one. Okay, Chaim, the floor is yours, my friend.
There's 3 though, really, right? Because there's 2 hays.
Okay, there you go. Here's your 3 again.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna hold here. Shikoyach.